So this is going to be a little different from the other talks because I'm presenting on completed projects or published papers. So, but I'm interested in the general topic, so I might write further papers, and I'm also just interested in sort of sharing some of the ideas. I think there's some scope for mechanism design, market design, and so what I'm going to do is basically give an abridged version of the paper, and then sprinkle throughout some of the random thoughts I had in the course of the project on contract design. So it's about reducing deforestation through a particular kind of program, which is called payments for ecosystem services, which is paying people to do something that's good for the environment. And so this is based on a project in Uganda. So the main impact evaluation, most of what I'm going to present is a paper with several co-authors that was published in Science last year. And then I'm going to have a couple points that are made in smaller papers. One is an AER papers and proceedings, and then another is a recent, or I guess it's probably forthcoming paper with Kelsey Jack that's in PNAS. Okay, so just to motivate this, why are we thinking about reducing deforestation in Uganda? One of the main motivations is carbon. So if you go back to your elementary school science, trees are absorbing carbon dioxide, and so those tree trunks are mostly carbon atoms, and when those trees get cut down for whatever reason and they're burned or they decompose, that carbon is going into the atmosphere and is raising CO2 levels. And and so when blue ribbon panels think about how should we reduce climate change worldwide, what comes out on top is reducing deforestation in poor countries, just for the simple reason that the income people are generating from this activity, like their opportunity costs of not doing it, are just lower in global terms than all of us switching to electric vehicles or cleaning up the coal plants in richer countries. And so it's really about the fact that most of the deforestation today is in poor countries and people aren't generating a ton of income. And this is really a truly global externality where we don't care if we reduce a ton of CO2 emissions in Cambridge or Western Uganda. So as I said, the program we're going to think about is a PES program. Why don't you ban people from doing this? I think there are two reasons. One is, in a lot of poor countries, the regulatory environment isn't great to ban things, but also people are poor and they're making money from this. And so the PES is turning the stick into a carrot so people are not impoverished by trying to help the environment. And so if we think this is a problem caused by rich countries can fund this and make everybody in poor countries better off, but it's still an efficient way to reduce CO2 emissions. And so PES is paying people for an environmental behavior. For a development economist, this is a conditional cash transfer, but rather than paying people to send their kids to school, you're paying them to in our case, preserve the forest. So in Western Uganda, a lot of the forest is privately owned, and so it's working with people who own the forest, who own the right to cut down those trees, and it's paying them a certain amount, a flow amount each year, if they keep those trees intact. So just as a first little aside about design, in some ways, people are living on this land, their homes are there, and the optimal contract would be, or one kind of contract would be to buy the rights to the trees and let them have other rights to the land. You don't want to buy up the land entirely because you'd have to move a bunch of people, but what you want is the rights to the trees, and in some ways this PES is a rental version of that contract. So this has been the big programs worldwide are in Costa Rica, Mexico, and China. And this project is really trying to have a better, kind of more rigorous evaluation of this kind of program. And so the two reasons why this might not work as well in practice as it does on paper, I think the first one is the major one that we can improve on, which is just this idea of inframarginality, that people aren't cutting down all of their forest every year or we wouldn't have any forests left. And so you're paying someone for an activity that maybe they were going to do anyway. Maybe they were going to conserve anyway. And so then you're paying people, but they might not actually be leading, it might not be leading to more forest cover than without the program. And so you're spending money and not getting much benefit, or at least the amount of benefit might be smaller than the nominal amount you're paying for. And so, economics would call this inframarginality, that payment was inframarginal to their behavior. In ecology, in conservation, this is called additionality. How much additional forest cover do you get from the program? And a second one that, the nature of our project, we can look at some aspect of it, but you can think of it in a broader sense too, and we can't address that, which is leakage. People are going to shift their behavior. They're going to respond on different margins. And so we can look whether they shift their tree cutting to neighboring areas in Western Uganda, I think there's a broader sense of it is, okay, if you ran this worldwide and the cost of coal went up, would people be switching to something that has a cleaner footprint in terms of carbon? I think in that case they probably would, but something like building materials, if they're not using wood, it's, I don't know what they're going to switch to, and there is this net benefit that you really need to know the entire system that I think an impact evaluation is not well suited for. So we did an RCT in 60 villages where households that owned natural forests were paid a flow amount if they left their forest intact, and then the main outcome we're going to look at is tree cover. How many extra hectares of trees are generated by this program, which we're going to measure using satellite imagery. So one of my co-authors is Eric Lamben, who's a quite well-known remote sensing expert at Stanford, and so his team led the measurement of the forest cover. And then the last part of this project is sort of actually an afterthought, but I think ex post it ends up being a nice aspect of the paper, which is just to do a cost-benefit analysis. And so the benefit of CO2 compared to other ecological benefits like oceans is that there are some off-the-shelf estimates. You can take them with a grain of salt because they're not perfect, but this is what Bill Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for earlier this month. Okay, so to preview the results, the intervention reduced deforestation. And this was a surprise to me in the sense that I started this project thinking that we were going to be the wet blanket, showing that some of these earlier studies that compared people who sign up and don't sign up, trying to control for covariates, were overestimating the benefits. And so, why is that? Is because, as I said, like a lot of people were going to keep their forest intact anyway, and standard Econ 101 thinking would say those guys should sign up in droves, and the people who actually were planning to deforest and have to change their behavior, they should be signing up less, and so that's going to kind of erode some of the benefits per person who signs up and you pay for. But we don't see anything, we don't see this correlation at all. There's no disproportionate sign up by those who would have conserved anyway, and I'll come back to what I can say about that, but that's certainly, like almost in a mechanical sense, key to why this program had such a big effect. And then we can look at this shifting of deforestation to neighboring land, and we don't see any evidence of it. And then the cost benefit, when we put the benefits in terms of tree cover into terms of CO2 and put a dollar value on that and compare that to the program cost, it looks quite cost effective. Okay, so context, study design, and program details. So that takes place in Western Uganda. So this is a Google Earth image, and I don't know how well you can see it, but there's sort of a dark green corridor in Western Uganda that's lighter green, where this is a settled area, and people who own this forest, especially in the last 50 years, have been cutting it down at a pretty high rate. And so those yellow dots are the area we worked in, the villages we worked in. So I emphasize carbon. This project was actually funded out of a biodiversity arm of United Nations Environment Program, because the Ugandan government's motive for wanting to preserve the forest is actually chimpanzees. So there's also other biodiversity, rare species of butterflies, but chimpanzees are a huge source of tourism dollars for Uganda. So chimpanzees are an endangered species, and they are getting their survival is being hurt by the fact that their habitat is all a patchwork. And as another kind of aside on design, for what we did a randomized experiment. So we have this patchwork of where we are saving the forest. And so, first of all, we can't measure chimpanzee survival because that's like a system-wide, landscape-wide impact, but you also wouldn't do the RCT design. But this, I think, kind of habitat is an example where there is complementarity of the land you would want to protect, whereas for carbon, I think you could also argue there's some complementarity, but it's not as pronounced as if you're trying to have an entire continuous corridor that chimpanzees can travel through. So Uganda has some of the highest rates of deforestation, which is 2.7% per year, and I'll show you when you see the results, you'll see we actually have a bigger loss than that when we look at tree cover. So one of the things that, there's a distinction between forest loss, which is, think of the perimeter of a forest shrinking, versus tree loss, which is going to include the degradation and the thinning of trees. And so there's been some recent work that shows worldwide, like 50% of the tree loss is actually this degradation. And especially in Uganda, it's small landholders. They're not clear cutting. They're chopping down a 40 meter by 40 meter plot of land, or 10 trees here and 10 trees there. And so these estimates of forest loss are actually they're underestimating by quite a bit the loss of trees. And then 70% of forested land in Uganda is privately owned land, which is the part that we're going to focus on in this study.
Should we think of this as primary forest, or is it sort of managed forest?
So this is primary forest. And so one of the, I think, puzzles to me, I don't have an answer to this, of like, people are making money off of trees, but when they cut their trees down, they're not planting new trees. And so, why is that? And I don't think people have this mindset of this is a business opportunity, even though they're making income. And so it's like a relatively recent phenomenon that there's this demand for charcoal in urban areas, and that the timber dealers are coming, et cetera. So it's almost like, this land has been in their family for generations. In the past couple decades, people are coming by and saying you can make money, and people monetize it. But nobody bought this forest because they thought this was an asset. What had been in their backyard was now an asset, and I think it is an interesting kind of different angle, which is, could you sort of turn people into foresters who are actually trying to manage the forest? Okay, so why are people cutting? I mentioned cultivating and then selling charcoal or to timber dealers who make lumber, 2x4s and things like that. And so those are the two broad classes. And so, one thing that also comes up, and this is the point I made in that PMP paper, which is, these two kinds of uses for forests or reasons to cut trees are quite different in terms of the time pattern of income. So if people are cultivating, and by clearing land they're going to get some agricultural income each year, then this idea of an annual payment, you just need to outbid that payment. You're making this flow payment, and if that land is intact, I just have to give you more than that. If people are cutting trees, that's the asset value you're getting, and that's a lump sum income. And it's not like you would want to pay people the value of their trees, that whole asset, every single year for perpetuity, to not cut it down once. And so, how would we think about this? You would want to pay people the value of that asset times their interest rate, just to delay cutting it down for a year. But those interest rates, are pretty high. People have so this was one we thought about. Had we had more bandwidth, I think we would have tried to cross-randomize with access to credit, because there's other work that says access to credit might increase deforestation, because people can buy the chainsaw or what have you, or they can buy the tractor and they need more land. But I think in our setting, people are cutting down trees for emergency cash. They need some to pay a hospital bill, or emergencies like school bills, and they're cutting down trees, and so to delay that, you'd have to pay them a lot. I think one complication of this, that I'll throw this out there, I don't have thoughts on it, is that this all makes sense over short delays. Like, if you push people to delay cutting a tree by 1 year, you would the value of it wouldn't change that much. But kind of like for perpetuity, at some point it might make sense to cut down a tree. It's not adding that much in terms of the ecological value. If it's about to fall down, you might want to cut it anyway. And then similarly, like, I don't know enough about the value of timber, but you can imagine that trees, as they might get sickly or something, or they get crooked as they get older, and the value. So just thinking about exactly kind of how you want to, this time profile, I think it's pretty complicated in terms of both the benefit side ecologically, and in terms of the sales, to sort of figure out what you would want to do, how long you would want people to delay, and how much you would have to pay them.
Are these mostly mutually exclusive uses? I would imagine that in some cases I could do both, right? I could cut down.
Yeah, I think they end up being mutually exclusive in the sense that people, when they cut trees for cultivation, they do it adjacent, and whereas when they cut for timber, they sort of start with their most valuable trees, and those might not be aligned. But certainly, like, if you're going to cut and there's some tree, it doesn't require, you can have a crooked tree be charcoal, so they'll turn it into charcoal. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But if people are have the hospital bill, they're just looking for their most valuable trees. Okay, I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but this is the flow chart of what we did. So we started in 2010, and we did a census of the villages that, based on Landsat satellite data, had forest, and then we enumerated who the forest owners were. So if you see PFO, that's an abbreviation for private forest owner. And then we chose 121 villages where we did the study. So we did a baseline survey of the forest owners, and then we did public lotteries and chose the treatment villages. The randomization was at the village level. And then at that point, we hand over to an NGO that ran the program. So they marketed this program to the forest owners to saw if they wanted to sign up. If they signed up, they had to sign a contract. And then that contract, part of what it did is it gave the right to the NGO to go onto their land and look if they cut trees. So the actual monitoring of the program was with boots on the ground. And then they paid them once a year if they had complied. And then we went and did an Inline survey. So that's the kind of normal field work on the ground. But in our case, our main outcome is going to be the satellite imagery. We're going to analyze the baseline and Inline data, but the main outcome is going to be the satellite imagery, where it's not a satellite that has continuous global coverage, and so we task a satellite to take images of our area at baseline and Inline. And so this is one where both for the monitoring part of a program and for evaluation, this will improve quickly, because we paid something like $60,000 per wave for this satellite imagery because it's pretty high resolution, but this stuff will obviously get cheaper over time. Okay, so what is the program details? And here, how is this program designed? It certainly was not having kind of a mechanism design person thinking about the optimal contract. This was the NGO had the right to have the contract. There were a different NGO that had foresters who weighed in. And then we, as the evaluators, were kind of the economists around, and we certainly had some thoughts on things. And so we collected some data on opportunity costs to try to get a sense of payment levels. And I'll mention a couple clauses we suggested that they add. So the NGO is called Chimpanzee Sanctuary and Wildlife Conservation Trust, or CSWCT. Then that name is because their primary activity is running a sanctuary for orphaned and injured chimpanzees off of the capital city of Entebbe, but then they also have activities in western Uganda. So the contract offered, it's a pretty blunt, simple contract. And so that's maybe my first point, which is, foresters, when I've presented this in front of people who are experts in forestry, they'll say this is not a good contract. Optimal forestry management is more complicated than that. Sometimes you want to cut some trees because it'll allow more sunlight to saplings and they'll grow faster. And they're inevitably right. But then, the other part of what we find is in some ways this contract was too complicated for people to understand, or for the NGO to, making it more complicated would make it hard for the NGO to monitor. It would make it hard for people to understand what they're being signed up for. So, I do think this is one where there's probably some good conversations to be had between forestry experts and people who think about contract design to see, what is optimal, where part of optimal is it's transparent, it's easy to monitor and enforce, and there's a fairness aspect, and you're not intimidating people with the contract. And so this contract is basically don't cut any trees above a certain size. So it paid $28 per hectare per year for compliance. So how is that amount how did we come up with that amount? There was no kind of auction or revelation trying to get at it. We did some surveys of people of their income, and people aren't great at estimating their income from cultivation, so it was pretty rough. And this was really a negotiation, because I think from the NGO's point of view, they would rather have a higher payment. They're going to make people happier that way. But it kind of our results suggest it was good. They wanted it at 70, it was a bargaining process, and 28 seemed like it was closer to the say 75th percentile of their willingness to accept. And so this is more than the foregone income from cultivation, but it is not enough for a lot of people. Conditional on cutting some trees, people are making $100 or $150 a year, so it wasn't covering the entire cost value of the lumber. And so if someone didn't have even a 50% interest rate credit, this might not be enough to induce them. So it required not cutting mature trees, which are defined by the diameter at breast height of a tree, and then the boots on the ground monitoring by CSWCT. So one thing that, in the course of this, those big national programs in Mexico and Costa Rica, they don't require you to enroll all of your land. So I think that's a first order change we made that seems pretty obvious, I think, probably to everybody in this room, because if you could set aside some land, and this is the land you don't enroll, and you do all your cutting there, and then you enroll this, and you get paid for it, it's just very easy to shift. People aren't cutting down all of their forests every year. And we also had the temporal analog of that, which is you could withdraw from the program. You could say, no, thank you anymore. You can't come on my land anymore, and I don't want any money from you anymore. But you couldn't then re-enroll, because again, that would just allow you to say, I'm going to cut in November and then enroll in December. It's just too easy. Yeah.
How do you stop people from separating into multiple subunits?
Yeah, and like colluding, but you and Ben, is that what you mean? Or, oh, I see. You're saying something different, like of defining who's a, yeah, and even without subdividing, neighbors could collude, like you, not collude, it's like legal, Ben could enroll and you wouldn't, and then Scott, you'd let Ben cut on your trees and you'd split the money. And so there's nothing in this that prevents that. So, if you look at this contract and you think, what if I had offered this to economists? You'd say, wow, I would have lost a lot of money. Because there are just lots of ways to have circumvented it in those kinds of ways. I'll mention, let me be a little bit, sort of step back a little bit from that point, which is, how are people using this land? If they were mostly using it for building materials for their own home, then there'd be a lot of incentive to do that. But if they're selling it to timber dealers, there's not going to be a lot of value add of I forget who was signing up and who wasn't, of you need emergency money, so you're going to go to Ben's land and cut the trees, and you don't have much of a value add compared to Ben having done that himself. And so, in terms of agricultural land, you don't want to do it across the village, or there's some cost of going off very far and doing it. So just the nature of why people are cutting. Other people's land wasn't an amazing substitute, but I certainly was surprised there wasn't more of that.
So can I just ask an ecological question? So I thought that trees only sequester carbon when they grow.
Yeah.
So what's the incentive for not cutting mature trees? Because they basically have no added carbon value.
So there are two things. Mature, they're still growing some, right? Because they're but the stock, when we do our cost benefit, it's all about the stock rather than the flow. So there's the flow of a smaller tree is higher, but that's not completely true because the mass is bigger, but at some point the sort of relative to their mass, the flow. But it's the stock, because it's released soon, that the stock just swamps the flow once you put these things in NPV values, which is also seeing why reducing deforestation has a bigger CO2 impact than tree planting can. And these are primary forests, so it's also those tree farms don't create habitats for butterflies and things like that. But it's just just think of the CO2 release. Was there a question? Okay, so one thing about this non-enrollment, which is again, we didn't have to worry too much about it because we were just doing this prototype for a couple years, but non-enrollment is an absorbing state. That's not, it doesn't make sense if everybody has an emergency that they can't cover with, they can't get the loan, and so they need to cut trees and they're not in it, and if they can't re-enroll, pretty soon nobody is eligible for your program, and obviously that doesn't make sense. And so, when you think about it, it's solvable in the sense if you can make the payment levels a function of the tree density, or and even without that reason, just the carbon stock, a tree is not a tree. There are different species have different different maturity levels. You can make this quite complicated, and I think kind of going forward, if these kinds of programs are scaled up, I think you need the challenge will be to think about what's the minimal complexity you need to avoid things like nobody's eligible anymore because everybody had an emergency and had to withdraw, but without making it so complicated that there isn't local capacity to decide what is someone's payment level, and for people to trust why are they getting paid more than me, So we have this beauty of a simplistic contract, but I don't think this simplistic, that tried to avoid close some loopholes to cheat, but I think it wouldn't be feasible to run this kind of contract for 30 years.
I mean, it seems like maybe one way to go is to think of the trees as, make the trees collateral for loans. Think of a credit arrangement where they can use the trees as collateral for kind of.
And then if they default, what happens? Yeah, I mean, you have to have property right. You have to be able to own property rights over a tree, right, on someone's land or something, or take their whole land. Yeah, I mean, I get.
Yeah, just somehow to connect this risk sharing concern with the.
Yeah.
With the ecological concern.
Yeah. No, I think there's probably something there too. And I'm just it's the collateral part. It's not like the the lender wants to cut the tree in the scenario, in this case, like they want to keep it intact. Okay, so we use satellite data, household survey, and then we use CSWCT's data on who signed up and did they comply and how much did they pay them. And so the satellite Imagery is this commercial satellite called QuickBird that's run by a company called Digital Globe, and we have it at baseline and endline. It has a resolution of 2.4 meters in multispectral. In black and white, it's a resolution of 0.6 meters. So this is like pretty small pixel, and so you can see basically every tree. And why is that important in our setting like Landsat, which is free, and we could have had it at higher frequency as well? That has a resolution of 30 meters, and so when people are owning like 2 hectares, 30-meter pixel, you have like 11 pixels or something on that order on their land, and if they're cutting 5 trees, that's going to be hard to detect. Whereas so at least for this, I think if you're working in a place where people are clear cutting, you could get by with coarser satellite imagery. So I don't know how well you could see this, but if you look at this image close up, you could see every tree with your naked eye, every tree crown. Obviously, we didn't hand code this stuff, but like there are 300 million pixels, but it is that resolution that you could see stuff. And so this is what Eric Lamben's team did. And just as an aside for anybody who uses satellite imagery, I found this interesting. When you with this high resolution imagery, you're no longer doing like the sort of greenness, the vegetation index for the entire pixel. You're using the spatial correlation between pixels. So like if what is a tree crown, it's going to be maybe the size of this open area, and it's not going to have smooth edges, it's going to have jagged edges, and it's going to be like a compact shape. It's not going to be this area but long and narrow. It's going to be kind of roundish in shape. And so you use all of that information and you classify things into objects, and then you sort things into objects, and then you classify the objects. And so that resolution gains you kind of the ability. You no longer want to look pixel by pixel at whether it's green or not. Okay, so our sample is going to be the people we surveyed at baseline who we have GPS coordinates for. So in the satellite imagery analysis, we're just going to use village boundaries, but when we look at individual level effects, we have these 1,099 forest owners where we have their GPS coordinates at the beginning. Okay, so results. So first result is, and this was like a source of anxiety for me for 2 years, which was we have pretty low enrollment rate. So that's surprising because there's no penalty for signing up and cutting your trees. You just don't get paid. And so this would feel like it's option value that maybe these guys will screw up and not monitor correctly and still pay you, or maybe something will change and you won't end up deciding to cut trees, and so you should sign up, and then worst case is you don't get anything. And so why was there a 32% enrollment rate? So a lot of it, most of it is for mundane reasons. So in our Inline survey, we asked people about their knowledge of the program, and in the treatment villages, most of the people who didn't sign up weren't aware of the program. So CSWCT did a lot of things well, but I think they could have done a better job of just getting the word out there about this program, and also how to sign up. Not just that it exists, but what do I need to do to sign up? So one thing that's, like a negative, but I'll show you also might have some positives, is that you had to actively sign up for this program, and that's because of the nature of the monitoring. It would be trespassing to go on someone's land to monitor if they hadn't given you permission. And so if you had, I actually don't know the ethics of we certainly take satellite imagery of people's land without their permission. So if you had remote monitoring, perhaps you could have like a default in, just because I think a lot of the CCT's conditional cash transfers we're used to, you don't have to actively sign up that I'm going to go get prenatal care, so I'd like to get payment. And this one, you had to actively sign up.
What would a default in look like in this context? Is it like everyone, you still have to know that you even have this option of not cutting down your trees?
Yeah, you'd still have to announce it. So it's not like it wouldn't have any effect on behavior if people weren't aware of it. You'd just have infra marginality. But you wouldn't have to have been there on the day to turn in your contract. And so this is the next point I was going to make, which is that people have to sign a contract around their land, and many people have de facto property rights, but they don't have a title, and they are just fearful when someone comes around from, some educated person comes around and says, do you want to sign this contract? Hey, it's like a great deal. I'm just, nothing for you to lose. I'm going to pay you money if you keep your trees in cash, sign on the dotted line. I think people aren't used to that, signing contracts and not getting hoodwinked. And so there are some I think not just apocryphal stories. In this area, there's also oil or kind of nearby, and people had come by and said, hey, I want to buy your land, and then they had sold their land, and that the buyer became rich off of the oil rights, and and someone felt like a sucker and did lose money. And so I think this like having to sign a contract is what active default would avoid, and especially in this context. So this is another one where like the property rights regime is probably going to interact with people's willingness to sign up. On the flip side, I think people saw this signing up as a way of endorsing their property rights. So like another benefit of it could be that people feel like someone just plotted out my land and recognized it as mine, and so that gives me a little bit more security over my land. And so, at this point that, I'll come back to the specifics we see here around contract familiarity, but this program, coming back to this point that what we didn't see this, the people who were going to deforest a lot signed up very little, and the people who were going to conserve thought this was an awesome deal. Like that wasn't the only determinant of who signed up. There were these other factors like, did you have the flexibility to go turn in your contract, and were you familiar with contracts? Were you trusting of outsiders? And so this is going to affect, take up just as much as sort of what we would think as the first order economic reason. And some of these correlates, some of these other things could happen to be correlated with your counterfactual deforestation. So additionality is going to be affected by these other factors, not in a deep sense, but because they are in fact correlated. Okay, and so then we don't have a way of monitoring the monitors, but it's consistent with our results that the program led to more tree cover. But most of the people who signed up for the contract, CSWCT deemed to have complied. So most of the enrollees were paid all or most of what they were entitled to. So you should think of the typical person has 2 hectares of forest. They own 10 hectares of land, 2 hectares of it is this primary forest, and so they were paid this $28 per hectare, so they made $56 a year, and it was a 2-year program, so that would be $112. The actual average payment level for those who signed up was $108. Okay, so here's the main result on tree cover. So this is in proportional terms. So the green bar is what happened in the control villages. Status quo between baseline and endline, which was a little less than 2 years later, there was 9.1% loss of tree cover. So that's a really rapid rate of loss of trees. I mentioned that that's, is going to be higher than the 2.7% per year, which was forest loss. And so, I think the difference is this might, that's a Uganda-wide number. This area might have a higher rate, but part of that difference is also just the distinction between trees and the coarser measure of forest. So what happened in the treatment villages? There was still net loss of trees. It was just much lower. So it was 4.2% loss rather than 9.1%. Loss. And so I'm going to come back to the effect size because that's big. It's halved it, and that's certainly not less than the sign-up rate, and in fact it's higher than the sign-up rate.
Maybe you're going to come back to this, but what do chimpanzees care about? Like, are they affected by this thinning, or do they mostly care about having a contiguous area that they can go into? I was just wondering if the other measure is what's relevant for the chimpanzees.
Yeah, so I think the forest. I guess it depends a little bit on the resolution people are using when they define the forest. It's like, it's some 2.5 hectares continuous, continuous trees is the definition. They probably would care more about the forest than this thinning, but we're going to do our entire cost benefit in terms of carbon, and I think for carbon, this matters more. So, like Eric, my co-author, likes to say that, the chimpanzee benefit is far bigger than the carbon benefit. But realistically, if these programs are going to get funded, they're not going to get funded because of chimpanzees, because chimpanzees aren't going to dying off aren't going to lower productivity in the U.S. And we know how to put a dollar value on, I think it's like an interesting. Someone should try to figure out what would be the chimpanzee benefits of this, but I guess we focused on carbon just because A, it's doable, and B, I do think that's like the path to scale up.
Do you have a sense of what these estimates imply about steady state number of trees? If you have the rate of deforestation, that sounds great, but if in a decade we don't have forests anywhere, then
Yeah, so it is true that this program, if it's getting 4% and then, and I don't know how the rate will change as you have less and less forest, but it does suggest that even at 4% in 25 years, like whatever, there's not going to be much forest left. So there is some regeneration. So I guess the answer is probably, yeah, if you want this, if you're just delaying things by, you'll see in the cost benefit, like delaying things by 25 years is still beneficial, but but yeah, you probably want to get it lower than what it is. Okay, I'm not going to show you, anybody who won robustness checks is going to be disappointed. I'm just going to show you one regression table, which is the village level analysis, which is showing you what I showed you in the graph. So that's a village level analysis where it's the change in tree cover. So when I show you in levels, it's in hectares. So it's like each pixel is whatever size, 2.4 meters by 2.4 meters. We can convert that to hectares and see how many pixels are forest trees. And then we're gonna the treatments at the village level, and then basically the main control are going to be the stratification dummies, which are sub-county dummies, and the baseline. And I guess we don't have baseline level. This is in changes. Okay, so the first two columns are in levels, and so you see that there's 13.4 hectares of loss of tree cover over these 2 years, and it's reduced, the amount of loss is reduced by 5.5 hectares in the treatment villages, and then the last column is exactly what I plotted on that graph. It's 9.5 log points in the control villages. That's that 9.2%, and then taking that difference, it's the effect in the treatment villages. It's so 9.2%, and then the 4.1%. Okay, so it's a big effect size. So it means there's no selective sign up by those who would have conserved anyway. You can infer this just from the enrollment rate and the effect size. We saw this 32% enrollment rate and like a 50% drop, and so that should, certainly surprise me, and presumably surprises everybody here. And it's like the key to whatever magic that was. If that magic goes away, these programs won't be as effective. And so we can also look at it more specifically by using the control group and to predict the deforestation in the control group with their baseline characteristics, and then we can project that into the treatment group and know everybody's counterfactual deforestation, and you could see, was enrollment higher among those unobservable characteristics, and that correlation's pretty low. So, on observables, it's uncorrelated, and then on unobservables, it's sort of correlated a little bit in the wrong way, and that's the puzzle. And I'm not going to have a deep answer to that puzzle, but I think that's kind of, why the answer of whether people would learn to be savvier. This is about starting a program and people aren't sophisticated enough. Over time they become more like Homo economicus, and that reduces the program effectiveness. I think that's a big question. So one thing that was true in our setting is that some barriers to enrollment actually helped. So people who were unfamiliar with contracts, they hadn't signed written contracts before, they were less likely to sign up for this program. Like they were intimidated by or fearful of this. Those folks also have lower counterfactual deforestation. Think about, maybe it's people who are like less tied into the market, so they hadn't been working with timber dealers where they might have signed a contract, or they just weren't as sophisticated in their market activity. And so that ended up helping, that yes, you depressed enrollment by intimidating people around a contract, but the composition you got ended up being beneficial. So some of these people who you would have enrolled, you would have paid them, but you were paying them for nothing additional because they were going to conserve anyway. They didn't sign up, and so we obviously didn't anticipate this or design this, but it does raise this question of ordeal mechanisms and features of contracts and what kind of selection it will choose. And so that's this PNAS paper of Kelsey Jackson Vine. There's some similar things she finds in some of her programs around tree planting, that kind of credit constraints are a factor in who signs up for her programs, and those could be correlated with being able to keep your having good access to credit could be correlated with having the skills to keep trees intact. And people might not be aware of their skills to have trees intact, and so you could luck into having good screening, and or but it could just as easily go the other way. I think there's another thing that I think is going on, and this is just pure conjecture, but if I could go back and add one more question, it would have been to ask people to forecast their deforestation in the next 2 years. And I just think when we think about signing up for a contract and how people should choose we're assuming a lot of planning and rationality, and I think people didn't do the, aren't doing the planning. I think people wouldn't have guessed this. And then my guess is that like signing up for this contract might have had a treatment effect, because we also see that most people who signed up complied, and so I think we don't have the data or the design to have to test this, but I think as I said, it's just a pure guess that that's part of what's going on, that we didn't get the selection you would get, and then people actually change their behavior conditional on signing up. So so is there shifting of tree cutting elsewhere? So these results I showed you are for an entire village boundary, and these forest owners own like 20% of the land in the village. So there's a lot of other, and they own most of the trees, but not all of the trees. And so there are a bunch of other trees they could have cut, to shift. And what I showed you is net of that. So if Ben and Scott were in the same village and they had colluded and one signed up and one didn't, they're both in their land is both in our sample, and so we're seeing the results net of that. Or maybe, one of them wasn't a forest owner, they didn't have natural forest, but they had some other clump of trees, and if we had seen shifting there, the results are net of that. So I think most of the obvious scope to cut your trees elsewhere is going to be within your village, and we see big effects net of that. We can also look at government reserves are another place you could steal trees from, and so we can look at villages that are near to government reserves, and we don't see bigger impacts there because they had an easier way to cheat. And then we also look at spillovers to control villages, partly just to think about internal validity, but also as another potential place there might be spillovers, and we don't see evidence of those spillovers. So partly, and we can also look at prices of timber and what people report. And I think it's not surprising that we don't see evidence of price effects. This is all feeding into a national market, and we worked with 60 villages, and 32% of people signed up. So it's not a big chunk of the national market for timber or for charcoal, and so there's just not enough statistical power. This isn't a big enough change in supply to change prices. But obviously, if you scaled something up, if this were the kind of program at scale, and charcoal became more expensive and timber became more expensive, then GE effects become important, and these that's like a standard limitation of doing something in a smaller scale, is we can't speak to that. Okay, so with the Inline survey, we can see people reduced tree cutting and self-reports. If I'd shown you just that, you probably wouldn't have found it very convincing, but it's nice that it corroborates what we see in the satellite data. Interestingly, they reduced their forest access to their poor neighbors. So this is one where, if I had to tell someone to do this again, I would say pair this with cash transfers for the very poor people who don't own forest and so aren't benefiting, because there's this norm that people let their poorer neighbors onto their land to gather firewood or building material, and then they stop doing that. And so I don't know, I don't think it was like a huge loss, but I don't think some new norm evolved or was created where they started sharing some of their cash payments with their poor neighbors. I don't think so. There was no gain or loss of consumption. People could have had some loss if they were, on this idea that they were just getting this like interest rate and they still own this asset later. They could have foregone some income today to be in the program. And in terms of gain of consumption, in some ways we kind of lucked out that we wouldn't have wanted to pay too much, because again, these aren't the poorest people in the village. They're rich enough to own forests. So if you rather than making more cash transfers to them, you should have just moved that money to poorer people. So I think, this is not a case like where you're serving the poorest of the poor, where you are thinking, it's great, I don't mind if I'm making a transfer with extra money. So in terms of cost effectiveness, I'm just going to breeze through this. We convert our hectares of tree cover, which we have from our regression analysis, to how many tons of carbon dioxide emissions were delayed. So this isn't permanent, but it's delayed, and we can think about the benefit of that delay of catastrophe in the world. And then we can put a dollar value on that in terms of using the social cost of carbon. And so that 5.5 hectares per village that I showed you, that's equivalent to 3,000 metric tons of CO2 per village that were delayed. And so and how do we get that number? Global Forest Watch has carbon density in different parts of the world, so we can overlay our villages and see the carbon density in this part of Uganda. The more complicated thing is to convert each ton of CO2 into a dollar value. And so the dollar value is $1.11. How do we get that? We use the EPA's social cost of carbon, which is basically Bill Nordhaus's model, which is roughly $40 to permanently avert a ton of CO2. And then we have to make assumptions of like how long. The biggest assumption, the most important assumption is, what will people do after the program ends? Because how long you've delayed this depends on whether people cut everything the day the program ends, or they go back to business as usual, or things like that. So we take a pretty conservative assumption. And then we can think about the program costs, and so that's both the payments and the administrative costs, and that's 46 cents per delayed ton of CO2. We can put it in these same units, and so that benefit is larger than the cost. So as I said, the biggest assumption that could swing this is what would happen after the program ends. And so if people, this were economists, and just despite me, everybody cut everything the minute the program ended, that's when the benefit cost ratio falls to 0.8. If instead the forest owners deforest at their normal rate afterwards, the benefit cost skyrockets to 15. So we assume people are deforesting at a faster rate after the program. So we've actually now, the one work in progress I have on this is we've got some later satellite data, and it's actually, people are deforesting at the regular rate, and if anything, slightly less. So once we redo the benefit cost ratio with the actual, it's going to be much closer to the 15. And if you know the cost benefit calculations for things like hybrid vehicles or anything, kind of nothing comes out even above, with a benefit cost above 1. So this is like much more beneficial than most of at least the policies that economists have tried to put benefit cost numbers on. So let me just quickly use one more minute to wrap up some of these thoughts on program design, most of which I said. I think simple contracts are needed so that you can monitor and enforce them and people will sign up for them. But there's a tension because I think long-term programs have to make payments a function of tree density and forest size, to avoid kind of everybody exiting the program. I don't think people necessarily know their future deforestation, which makes some of our normal mechanisms and how people are going to select into them a little bit trickier to make work. I think factors besides how much you're going to conserve anyway affect your sign up, and that could be good if you screen out these always takers who would have just been being paid to do nothing, but it's bad if you're screening out compliers, and I think that ends up being important. I think credit constraints influence the success of this and the optimal design, in terms of how much people need to change their behavior. And then just last 2 points, I think this is one where people who are kind of not officially in the mechanism end up being affected, in our case, like the poor people who didn't own land, and so you have to think about their welfare, I think, as well. And then these GE effects, deforesting becomes much more lucrative if a big chunk of people have stopped cutting down trees and supplying to the market. So turn it over to Alex.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to discuss these 3 papers. It's one of these strange things where not only have the papers been published in these fabulous journals, but actually Seema has already discussed them for me. As you saw, that last slide had more ideas on it than I could have possibly come up with myself. So I think instead of sort of going through her results, since this is no longer work in progress, I will just offer some random thoughts on payments for ecosystem services that I've had, and they've been partly inspired by Seema's work. So let me just sort of give you a macro picture of this. Payments for ecosystem services is a gigantic industry. So this is not to think it's all kind of tiny little projects. So I looked at a survey that's been done recently, and there's something like 500,000 of these, and the value is sort of pushing tens of billions of dollars. The really big ones are it's surprising we don't hear about them more, but things like the Sloping Lands program in China that's been going on for 20 years for afforestation and to prevent soil erosion, or in the US, there is a huge, about a $10 billion market to mitigate wetland loss, which has been, in my opinion, quite successful actually in reducing the rate. And I'll come back to the Conservation Reserve Program and so on. And so programs like RED, which is reducing emissions through deforestation and degradation, they're worth tens of billions of dollars. So I think it's sort of important for us, if we care about these programs succeeding, to think about how to design them well. And so this is not just small programs in developing countries. These are gigantic programs all over the world. And they cover a ton of different things. So forest is a lovely example. In a way, it's a nice, neat example. What I want to talk about is sort of more messy examples of how you would want to scale payments for ecosystem services for things like biodiversity, for example. And these programs, moreover, some of them are funded by NGOs, others are funded by governments. And there is a sort of pertinent question of how do you fund them? What's the right way to do it? There are clearly people who are benefiting locally. In the case of forest, people are benefiting from this from Canada to Australia when we mitigated this carbon. So how should we actually fund them? So in a completely unrelated survey of the same thing, it seems like there's a lot of surveys in this field, but they come out in the same year, which is wonderful. There was a different survey of 70 payment for ecosystem services programs around the world. And what the authors did, they said, okay, well, there's sort of three things that matter for a successful program. One of them is that you sort of have to make sure you target the recipients of the program as well as possible. So this is call it spatial targeting. The second thing is some sense of conditionality. Is you need to be able to say that the payment I'm going to make you for providing this ecosystem service, it's going to be conditional on some kind of outcome. And if you don't comply, that perhaps you'll be punished. Or perhaps, as in Seema's case, maybe not. And the third thing is that you need some way of sort of differentiating payments or ensuring, for cost effectiveness reasons, you might want to pay some people more and some people less, depending on what their costs and benefits are, depending how kind of ecologically important they are. So it was clear, I think, that from Seema's talk that there is an element of spatial targeting because the people who were selected into the program, they were found by using satellites and the knowledge of the NGO. And there is clearly kind of conditionality. So people come and check whether you have complied. There is less of the kind of payment differentiation, right? As Seema said, there's a very simple contract. There wasn't so much in the view of how do we figure out who's the most cost-effective person. And actually, what these guys found who did this review, I was really surprised. You would have thought that most programs should have these elements present because they seem to be so basic from an economic point of view. But actually, it turns out just 2 out of 70 had all three. And that made me think, this is great. There is a ton of work to do because the state of the art in the payment for ecosystem service design is actually it's not very high, and so I think there's loads of opportunity to improve. Sorry, I'm going extremely slowly. I have more slides, but they're mainly pictures, so it's not okay. So let me just sort of main messages I took away from these lovely three papers. So first of all, how can we make these things work? So let me give you a list of the things that I think worked in this context and the things that perhaps were missing that are interesting to think about. So it seems like people need to understand, to be able to enroll, they need to understand cost and benefits, so kind of tick here. Somehow you need to worry about additionality and adverse selection, and Seema, of course, talked about this in great detail. You need to worry about leakage. Seema thought about this. You need to worry about compliance. Seema thought about this. You need to measure, and sort of for a lot of these programs, even for enormous programs like the ones in Costa Rica, there's been hardly any proper measurement of the costs and benefits of these programs. So we roll them out, they last for decades, we spend billions on them, and then people come back and they try to sort of measure them with sort of sensible quasi-experimental designs and sort of look at this, maybe we can, and then you find that actually, they've not been worth it, and you've sort of wasted 2 decades designing terrible programs. Here it's sort of the exact opposite. It's beautifully designed, carefully measured, which is great. It's not regressive, I think. So the feeling I got, it was not sort of just taking from the poor and giving to the rich. And what's nice is that because it's forest, you're sort of comparing apples to apples. A ton of carbon from a tree is another ton of carbon from a tree. We don't need to worry about whether we've saved a chimpanzee, but we killed a dolphin. Okay, so that's not something you want to do. So if one were to think about where to take this forward, right? So I no longer need to give a full referee report. I can just speculate where this can go. So here is some kind of general direction. So one of them is sort of worrying about transaction costs. As Seema pointed out, of course, transaction costs can go in both directions. They can have a positive impact in terms of selection into the program. But ultimately, if you're worrying about the program kind of running at a larger scale, you need to carry about transaction costs within the program, not just in terms of enrollment. So it allows you to have more flexible contracts, and it allows you to scale things. There's one thing. The other thing is sort of heterogeneity, both from thinking about how you can protect more diverse ecosystems, not just trees, but if you're interested in sort of protecting a river next to a meadow, but also heterogeneity from the perspective of the actors. So how do you find the people who are really good at conserving forest, or really good at planting trees and so on, right? The third thing is, which is critical, and again, this is something in these projects that wasn't really important, but something that in principle, if one were to scale payments for ecosystem services, you care about is ecological complementarity. So as Seema said, you often care about protecting contiguous land. And if we go beyond just caring about forest as a kind of sink for carbon, but as a habitat, then you care about both contiguity, meaning that you want to have trees close enough to each other so that chimpanzee can jump from one tree to the next, but also scale, in that you want the chimpanzee population to actually breed and sustain itself. And the last thing is sort of some sense of revenue neutrality. So how do we fund these? Who should funding them? I have no idea, okay? So this is going to obviously matter. All of these things will matter context by context. So just to kind of give you some idea, so a ton of people are working on this. You get some wonderful co-authors from Stanford. Here is a random advert for a project we have in Oxford where people are trying to measure land cover according to different, which provide different types of ecosystem services. So right now you can do this amazingly well. So this is not at a 2.5 by 2.5 meter. This is more like a 10 by 10 meter. But you can measure different types of ecosystem services just using satellites. And this is with kind of modern technology. Most of this is publicly available. So you have to combine a ton of different data sets, but it allows you to measure a ton of things. Not just carbon that you might care about, but also things like water flow and soil erosion. So in a place like China, where soil erosion has been such a big problem, this can be very valuable. So if you want to scale a program, you really want something like this that will both do the monitoring and also find the right place for this. So visit the website, Nature Trade, kind of very nice name. And this is zoologists who came up with it, surprisingly enough, not economists. So heterogeneity matters, right? It kind of matters whether you are, or like what kind of person you are. I think we don't need to, this is not a point to dwell on, but how do you design mechanisms that allow you to find people who are just good at doing natural capital conservation, because people inevitably have completely different opportunity costs. How do we find them? What kind of mechanisms do we need? And kind of ecological complementarity. So maybe I should have had a picture of a chimpanzee, but this is a lovely local bird that was in huge decline, right? And we know that birds need huge, vast, contiguous habitats to be able to survive. And so you need to protect this together. But the moment you think about designing a mechanism in which you want to protect a contiguous plot of land which is owned by different people, you can see the problems we're going to run into. Somebody could just sit and hold you up, and so how do you design mechanisms that prevent this kind of holdout is a huge problem. So people have obviously thought about more complex contracts than beyond the sort of the simple ones that Seema has evaluated. And in fact, in the US, we have one of the biggest conservation programs, not as much written about as I feel it should be, but there are auctions, billions of dollars worth of conservation auctions being held in the US every year through this conservation reserve program. And those are very simple, actually. So they're deliberately designed with that sort of simplicity in mind to make it as easy as possible. You just bid in and you say, I will do this particular action on my piece of land. Ben is telling me to shut up. But you can do more complicated things. So this cool project, it never happened, but it almost happened, so it's worth talking about. The Australian government wanted to force construction companies to not just bid to build a motorway, but then to offset the damage that was caused by the motorway by paying farmers to kind of increase their ecological value on their land. And so there was kind of this double combinatorial auction that was set up. Of course, eventually what happened is the construction companies lobbied to have this whole thing cancelled. But nevertheless, Charlie Plott and his co-authors designed this thing and tested it. And I think there's a lot of potential for, complex designs do not necessarily mean that the bidding and the participation is complex itself, right? But given the complexity of nature, it might be that we need complex designs anyway. So I'm not going to talk about this. I had this random idea. I've been thinking about this for a bit, and it was sort of inspired by some of the work of Glenn Weil and Anthony Zhang and Eric Posner. And it's about how you might sort of think about these sort of property rights regimes that are not just over the land itself, but over something that's particular on the land. So I called it depreciating natural capital licenses. They call it depreciating licenses. It's the same thing. But you might Can I have one more minute, if I can? Okay. So the idea, I think, is kind of, if you haven't encountered this, I think it's a cool idea. So Glenn and his co-authors, they resurrected an old idea of how you might try to prevent holdout on land. And the idea is the following. You sort of issue a license for use. And so to keep it concrete here, suppose I issue a license that says you can cut down this, you have a right to this forest on your land, or you might drill for oil, or you have a license to be able to go and fish. And so what you worry about is, what is this license worth to the landowner, right? And the idea is you ask people to state their value, and anybody can come and buy the license of you at the value that you state. And so the way to incentivize you to report your own value is you tax people in the appropriate way. You've got to set a tax. Let's not worry about the details of exactly how it's set. But one can set a tax that will incentivize you to truthfully report your value over this land. And by basically only giving you the right to compensation rather than the right over your own land, you also ensure kind of this balance between allocative and investment efficiency, right? So if I really value Ben's land and Ben says, this is not very valuable to me, I can just come and buy it off him whenever I want. And in the concept of natural capital, it's quite important, right? So if you think about people who are suffering from something like drilling, it might be an entire group of people. So what you might want to do is you might not just want to give anybody a right to buy this license, but in fact any group to buy a license. So people can pool their resources together and come and buy out a license and then sit on it and then say that their value is whatever amount and pay the tax. But what's cool about this system, I think, also is that it immediately raises tax revenue that you can use to compensate people who are being hurt by the externalities caused by the degradation of the land. So it's a wacky idea, but that's why we organize this conference, and I hope this is some nice food for thought. Thanks. Sorry, Ben.
Why you think that the rate was maintained or even decreased afterwards? And then also, I'd heard some things about forests not necessarily, because of the different reflection properties, them not necessarily being preserving forests being so great, but it depended whether it was tropical.
Yeah, I don't know there's this albedo thing. I think like most, it's like it's not as much as climate change, 97%, but I think most people think, at least in the tropics, the forest is having a net benefit, but there's like a temperature. They're causing heat, so like theoretically they could go the other way. So that's the second question. Yeah, I don't. I'll just here's a speculative reason why it could have. So I don't think people. I wasn't really expecting people to like deforest at a super high rate. So why do they go back to steady state? So what's possibilities, like they had these emergency expenses and they found other ways to do it. To solve them, and now they're like, and it's a stationary problem. They're not going to cut until the next emergency. So I think that's the most parsimonious. Like that's the way they cut. There's a world. We do see point estimates where it actually goes down a little bit. You could take, if there's a fixed cost of setting up a relationship with a bank or a lender or something, you could imagine that this forced people to come up with alternative ways of addressing emergency cash, and then once they paid that fixed cost after the program ended, they were doing less of it. So we don't, we tried to look at people's access to credit. We don't have enough power and enough exogenous variation to look at it, but that's my best guess